Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Ambiguous Territories panel. If there's any visitors in the room, I'm Isla Berman. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture. And we are going to, I'm going to introduce, just briefly introduce the exhibition, but Kathy Velikov will introduce it in far more detail, as she should. I'll introduce the panelists, and then we'll have a discussion up here, and after that, open it up for discussion with the audience, and after that, we'll have the exhibition opening upstairs at the Elmaleh. So this is an exhibition and symposium that was organized in the fall of 2017 that was supported by the University of Michigan, the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, and the University of Michigan Office of Research. The symposium and exhibition was curated by Kathy Velikov, Chris Perry, Cathryn Dwyre, and David Salomon. The brief for the exhibition was as follows. Ambiguous Territory, Architecture, Landscape, and the Post-Natural was a symposium and exhibition that situates contemporary discourses and practices of architecture and landscape within the context of the post-natural, the era of climate change, the Anthropocene, and altered ecologies. So the project asks, in a time when humans have been fundamentally displaced from their presumed place of privilege, philosophically as well as experientially, should the disciplines of architecture and landscape architecture consider displacing themselves as well in order to establish new affiliations and avail new ways to approach contemporary questions of design in relation to the environment? By bringing designers and scholars from these fields together, the exhibition highlights projects and ideas that are engaged with these issues from a variety of perspectives, ranging from scale and experience to questions of matter. Participants present research and work that use tactics of mediation to understand, imagine, interrupt, and invent artifacts that exist at the large spatial and slow temporal scale of the Anthropocene. Ambiguous Territory presents design ideas and proposals from architects, artists, and landscape architects whose work challenges their disciplinary boundaries and long-held anthropocentric orientation and redefines the relationship between the built and natural environments in an era of ecological anxiety. We're going to probe some of the framework of this in the panel discussion, but I want to congratulate Kathy and her team and all of the participants on what I think is a really amazing exhibition. The exhibition here was supported, co-supported by the Dean's Office and the Miles H. Thaler Endowment in Landscape Architecture, and I especially want to thank Sneha Patel, who basically coordinates all of our exhibitions and communications, Dick Smith, Melissa Goldman, and the Fab Lab crew for their fabrication assistance as well. And I'm going to just, so that we are not doing it before or in between, I'm going to sort of briefly introduce or give you the bios of all of our participants on the panel. So Kathy Velikov is an architect, associate professor at the University of Michigan, and the current president of Acadia. She is founding partner of the research-based practice, RVTR, which serves as a platform for exploration and experimentation in the agency of architecture and urban design within the context of dynamic ecological systems, infrastructures, materially and technologically mediated environments and emerging social organizations. The work ranges in scale from regional territories and urbanities to full-scale installation prototypes that explore responsive and kinetic envelopes that mediate energy, atmosphere, and interaction. Brad Cantrell, who I'm assuming that you all know or should know if you don't, is professor and chair of landscape architecture here at the School of Architecture. His role or his work focuses on the role of computation and media in environmental and ecological design. His work over the past decade generates methodologies of modeling, simulation, and embedded computation that expresses and engages the complexity of overlapping physical, cultural, and economic systems. His research and teaching focuses on digital film, simulation and modeling, responsive technologies to examine landform, process, and phenomenology. Jason Kelly Johnson, our next panelist. I probably should have you stand up so they know who you are in the end. Jason is a founding design partner of Future Cities Lab, an experimental design and research office based in San Francisco. Working in collaboration with his partner, Natalie Gattegno, Jason's produced a range of incredible award-winning projects that explore the intersection of public space, art, and architecture with advanced fabrication technologies, robotics, and responsive building systems. Future Cities Lab is at the forefront of exploring how advanced technology, social media, and the Internet of Things will profoundly affect how we live, work, communicate, and play in the future. And I should also say, beyond being a professor also at CCA and co-directing CCA's Digital Craft Lab, he's also a UVA alumnus of the school, and he's on our advisory board. Sean Lally, and Sean is teaching with us this semester. He is trained as an architect and a landscape architect. His work operates as a synthesis of two intense pressures on society today: humanity's manipulation of the environment and the bioengineering of the human body. His design works and experiments report on potential futures ahead, ones that do not follow along the false dichotomy presented in the media that the earth can only either be preserved or destroyed. Lally's work speculates on the shapes and aesthetics of space, including the social and political dynamics that will emerge when both the design of the environment and the human body are recognized as necessarily elastic for humanity to move forward. He's a tenured associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and as I said, currently our Miles Thaler visiting professor here in landscape architecture at UVA. And lastly, Alexander Robinson is the director of the USC Landscape Morphologies Lab and principal of the Landscape Design Research and Planning Practice, Office of Outdoor Research, based in Los Angeles. Robinson's research and practice is focused on the means necessary to advance the design and implementation of high-performance landscapes and infrastructures. He's motivated by multiple qualities that synthetic landscape solutions can offer to urban life across numerous spectrums ranging from experiential to performative. Under the umbrella of the Landscape Morphologies Lab, Alex works primarily within the Los Angeles regional sites such as the Los Angeles, the LA River, and Owens Lake to create new design methodologies necessary to allow emergent design within engineering paradigms. So that is our panel, and with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Kathy Velikov.
Okay, is this thing working? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Great. So thank you, Isla, for the kind introduction and the invitation to initiate a discussion around the Ambiguous Territory exhibition today. And thanks to Sneha and everyone involved in working to get this the exhibition here, for organizing this event. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion with a group of colleagues and friends, all of whom have worked in the exhibition, and moreover, whose work and ideas have been influential in the conceptualization of the exhibition and the ideas that form a constellation around it. Okay. Do you want both of them on? They're not going to be feedback. Okay. So as Isla mentioned, I'm a partner in the research practice RVTR, and just to introduce myself and my work really briefly, with a couple of images, we work experimentally through the intertwinements between architecture, the environment, technology, and ecology. And we work with, at the scale of material prototypes, exploring new possibilities for architecture, and particularly with these architectural skins that mediate energy, matter, information, space, and atmosphere between bodies and environments. Oops, the wrong way. Okay. And then we also work at the urban with urban infrastructures and at the territorial scale through practices and techniques of mapping, analysis, speculative design propositions, installations, and writing. And so a lot of the ideas that are behind the Ambiguous Territory exhibition are ones that we're here to talk about today, are latent in the work of the practice, but moreover, these are also ideas that I've been exploring with my students through studios and seminars. And as Isla mentioned, in this work, I'm really part of a larger collaborative effort. So in the exhibition, in the symposium that was held at Taubman College, and then in a forthcoming book by Akhtar, has really been the result of an extensive collaboration between me and my co-curators and co-editors now, David Salomon from Ithaca, Chris Perry from Rensselaer Polytechnic, and Cathryn Dwyre from Pratt Institute. Chris and Cathryn are also responsible for this fantastic drawing that's on the wall and in the show. And so that's to say that the ideas I'm presenting are not mine alone and have come out of all of these conversations, also conversations with colleagues, some of whom are on this panel and conversation with students. So the main impetus behind Ambiguous Territory is to try to define a moment that appears to be shared across the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and art, where designers and artists are positioning work in relation to emerging sensibilities regarding the environment in the context of climate change, the Anthropocene, altered landscapes, and embedded information where algorithms increasingly manage and create the world. And this is an image from the show when it was at Taubman College. And it looks a bit different here because it's in a light gallery as opposed to a dark one. But this work is not what would fall in the conventional ideas of environmental design. These works are, in these works, we're equally and really more concerned with what we could call the realm of eco-poetics, with exploring how we can think the environment in new ways, how we can think climate change, and how to approach questions of ecology through critical practices. And so, why is this important, some of you might ask? What can aesthetic practices do to intervene in this positive feedback loop of economic growth and environmental catastrophe that we find ourselves in? Well, to approach one answer to this question, I'll quote the late author, Ursula K. Le Guin, who passed away earlier this year. "We have got to change our minds," she says. "To use the world well, we need to relearn our being in it, renew our awareness, our belonging to the world. How do we go about it? We need the language of both science and poetry to save us from ignorant irresponsibility." So this sensibility, in many ways, is what is at the heart of this project, a kind of relational language that crosses both science and poetry. And then to continue a bit with the world of literature, I'm going to read a short passage from J.G. Ballard's 1962 novel, A Drowned World. And on the screen are going to be stills, and I'll start just showing stills in the background of works in the exhibition. So on the screen are stills from Ursula Beeman's film in the exhibition called Subatlantic, which, if you've seen it, are not about the book, but do share a lot of its condition and sensibility. So in The Drowned World, it's a science fiction novel that takes place in a near future that has been flooded. Not due to human action, but due to a solar anomaly that increases the sun's power enough to melt the polar ice caps. But the result is the same that we are witnessing with human-induced climate change, which is the Earth's temperature is increased, and the planet is submerged in water, with most of the population concentrated at the Arctic Circle, where there still exists a tolerable subtropical climate. The main character, Kearns, is a scientist on a biological research station sailing through submerged cities, mapping the new geography and the new flora and fauna that are rapidly evolving. But he also has a growing sense of the futility of the enterprise. And in Ballard's book, changes do not only take place in the external environment, but also in the internal state of mind and physiologies of the characters. So from the opening chapter, just a few lines. This growing sense of isolation and self-containment, exhibited by the other members of the unit, reminded Kearns of the slackening metabolism and biological withdrawal of all animal forms about to undergo a major metamorphosis. Sometimes he wondered what zone of transit he himself was entering, sure that his own withdrawal was symptomatic not of a dormant schizophrenia, but of a careful preparation for a radically new environment with its own internal landscape and logic, where old categories of thought would merely be an encumbrance. So humans' relationship to the environment is not only functional or social, but it is also biological, physiological, psychological, and emotional. So as we become increasingly self-aware of our being intertwined with a rapidly transforming planet and with our being deeply impactful on the Earth's atmospheric, biologic, and geologic processes, not only at the immediate scale, but also at the scale of the Earth and its geologic timeframes, we may be sensing, as Ballard's character does, questioning what old categories of thought are becoming an encumbrance and need to be shed, and what new categories of thought we might need to cultivate. Jamie Cruz and Elizabeth Ellsworth of Smudge Studio argue, and I quote from their writing, "The act of cultivating psychological, physical, and spiritual capacities for coexisting with big and fast change in the Anthropocene are as vital as any infrastructural, scientific, and preparatory or adaptive actions. They generate new sensations and meanings, potentials that open the future to new actions and arrangements, even if the future seems to be shutting down." One of these categories of thought that seems to be an encumbrance is the idea of nature, and this concept is part of the title of the show in the term the post-natural. The idea of nature that most of us hold today, or maybe held until recently, is that of an externalized, stable backdrop to human history. This has, by numerous authors, scientists, and philosophers, become exposed as primarily a 17th century Enlightenment, Western Enlightenment idea. Nature is recognized as a complex and powerful form of cultural discourse, and one whose boundaries are continually redefined and configured in order, like all cultural discourses, in order to do particular types of work. But the old dichotomies of culture and nature, or nature and the city, don't really do much for us these days. That nature is not what is out there. We haven't totally agreed what to call it, but we know that it is a co-creation, a kind of relationship that's an achievement among many actors, not all of them human and not all of them organic, and it's been going on for millennia. And with it, we exist in a complex relationship of simultaneous intertwinements and estrangements, affinities, and antagonisms. As a designer, I can no longer think a building as simply an object. It is also a hole in the ground on the other side of the world, dug by people who have a fraction of the income and quality of life that I enjoy. It's also a nexus of information and energy flows, and I'm worried that its air environment might be scarring my lung tissue, but I can't be sure. As philosopher Bruno Latour has argued, we need to find ways to love our monsters. How do we not ignore or abandon the landscapes and ecosystems that have been transformed, made toxic or uninhabitable through forms of violence? Here, visibility and aesthetic practices can operate politically, not necessarily only in content or in terms of exercise and struggle for power, but in the terms that Jacques Rancière laid out in his Politics of Aesthetics. The works themselves can intervene in the distribution of the sensible and its reconfiguration, redistributing spaces and times, subjects and objects, the common and the singular. Sorry. Another old form of thought, whoops, these are large slides. Another old form of thought that many contributors in the exhibition are working on shedding is the relational politics between ourselves and the planet, decentralizing the human from a position of privilege. The world is not made for us. The disillusion of boundaries between the human and the non-human. Author Donna Haraway urges us to find kinship with other species. Such a kinship might emerge from the peculiar and uncanny objects situated somewhere between living things and non-living things, or the development of gestures and languages of communication between non-human entities. Is there a language of plants that we can share? Asks artist Lindsay French. Or through other languages, can we find empathy with non-living things, such as in the work of Philip Beasley explores? Or can we use relational aesthetics to explore architectures made for other species? Find ourselves thinking in timescales outside of the immediacy of our own existence, through overlapping temporalities, geologic timescales. And perhaps we need new words for these forms of thought, new stories to tell ourselves, geostories, in the words of Design Earth, cosmomaterial scenographies, new narratives, in the words of Tim Morton, new tools for thought at Earth magnitude, a common cosmopolitics. At the same time as our ability to observe, measure, describe, and model the objects and phenomena of the world has increased radically, there is an unnerving realization that we still cannot know them. And so we paradoxically also find ourselves with a surfeit of information, yet increasingly estranged. And things that at one point were thought to be among the realms of the unknown have some point slipped back into a kind of terra incognita. And it is here that the work presented in Ambiguous Territory renders undeniably visible and thus recognizable all of the alluring, yet alienating, and potentially anxiety-inducing ways the contemporary haunting of a planet estranged from itself. These works move beyond the sensibilities of guilt or the hubristic idea that we can fix what is happening. Instead, they try to find different ways of being with the world, being with others within it. They point to approaches that might avoid the false choice that continues to haunt the disciplines of architecture and landscape. That is, the choice between a kind of naive conviction that architecture and landscape can and should be charged with solving the world's problems, as sustainability might have it, the fatalistic solipsism of a retreat to disciplinary or formal autonomy, as some resurgent practices would have it, or an abdication of design altogether through research without a larger propositional project. By avoiding such false choices, architects and landscape architects actualize their potential to engage in the world through their terms and through their own media. And so the assemblage of work aims to expand these discourses and design possibilities of ecological thought beyond the constraints of the clear-cut, the comforting, and the utilitarian, to bring them into this kind of realm of the ambiguous and perhaps unsettling. But what is the use value of ambiguity? Defined by uncertainty and indeterminacy, ambiguity would appear to be the antithesis of knowledge-making and knowledge production, as well as problem solving. Yet we argue that it is actually a device of knowledge-making itself. It is at the heart of poetry and literature, as William Empson has written in his 7 Types of Ambiguity. Ambiguity is productive of critical, intellectual, and aesthetic inquiry with its ability to hold multiple, sometimes contradictory ideas together at once, ultimately producing a kind of fertile source of novel relations. William Connolly, in his Politics of Ambiguity, argues that in order for democratic politics in modern society to flourish, it requires an appreciation of the ambiguous character of its most cherished standards and principles. And so he talks about strategies to incorporate ambiguity in political life. For example, in tribal societies, the trickster myth maintains the ambiguity of authority alive. And an aversion to ambiguity is what characterizes societies of control and authority, the social politics of the disciplining and normalization of the self, and the destructive logics of separation and control. And so with this exhibition, images of which have been running in the background as I speak, we've tried to gather recent work by architects, landscape architects, and artists who were exploring these very ideas and these very thoughts through the specific languages of aesthetic practices. And that is objects, drawings, photographs, film, and interactive media. To talk briefly about the curation of the show, the exhibition is kind of conceived as a salon. We always talked about it as a salon-type exhibition. So there were many voices and forms of exploration possible, and that each practice would only have one or two objects in the show. The organization of the exhibition itself is in many ways that of a landscape, a kind of territory of images and objects, and to organize them, we kind of conceptually clustered them through the organizational trope of a vertical cross-section through the earth, so through the planet, so above ground and the atmospheric, on ground, the biologic, and below ground, the geologic. And of course, these are useful only organizationally because obviously there's a lot of drift and overlap amongst these categories. And then the most important aspect, I think, is that this exhibition initiates a conversation as well as a reflection. And so concurrent with the Taubman College exhibition, we convened a one-day symposium that brought together contributors from this exhibition along with other voices. And I'm really happy that we're able to convene and continue this discourse today. In December, the show will be opening at Pratt Manhattan Gallery in New York City, and we'll plan for another symposium and hopefully another round of conversations early in the new year. And so with that, I think we can move on to some discussion.
These are floating. Can you all hear me?
Press it.
Yes. So I wanted to start because the exhibition is upstairs, and even though Kathy, you gave an overview, but each of those here weren't able to kind of present their works or talk about their works. Maybe I'm going to give you a few prompts, but ask you to answer through the projects that you've created. So I first wanted to talk about this notion of anthropocentric reorientation. You know, in the exhibition, there's let's say an attempt to move outside of not just disciplinary boundaries, but also outside of the long-held anthropocentric orientation and redefine the relationship between built and natural environments in an era of ecological anxiety. Now we could argue that on the one hand, this notion of the post-anthropocentric already came with modernism, right? I mean, this was the moment where humanism was sort of displaced. I was no longer, as a body, the center of the universe, where I measured the world in relationship to myself, or at least in relation to the king, right? Even though Americans still have the inch, foot, etc., but that was related to my hand, you know, my foot, and instead displaced it with the 0, 0, 0 Cartesian coordinate system. I'm told by physics, you know, that this is table, even though I perceive it as something that's solid and stable, but physics tells me no, it's actually mostly air, made up of moving molecules rapidly in space. And so So the modern subject is already, and of course the sun doesn't rise and set. I know that the earth is spinning. I'm held on it somehow, and it's tilted. And so as a modern subject, I'm already a schizophrenic subject because the world that I know and the world that I perceive are already two different things. And we know that my perception of the world from a humanistic standpoint was already displaced in the modern by rationalized, mathematical, scientific, and engineered system that through the extension of those fields and the amplification of my body through the machines that were produced and capitalism amongst others, that's what produced our current Anthropocene. That we call the terraforming of the earth with soot, plutonium, and lots of buildings. So if the aim of this exhibition in some ways is not to present a series of solutions to climate change or environmental resilience, but instead to help, I like this notion of cultivate an environmental sensibility. I think it's a great term that allows others to engage the work around us in a different way. I want you to elaborate specifically in relation to the works that you've produced in the exhibition, that you've contributed, how you are moving outside of this anthropocentric orientation within the works themselves, or cultivating this kind of environmental sensibility, and how is the human spectator also decentered in this process? Because I think there's a funny, maybe this comes from the double-sidedness of ambiguity or the paradox, that on the one hand, there's this idea of sort of decentering the human. I want to see life as a frog sees it, for example. But at the same time, what you had referred to, Kathy, as the renewing of our awareness or belonging to the world, which means that we somehow become more phenomenologically embedded in the world that we've produced, that we're already distanced from in a way. So maybe each of you could kind of talk about that in your work.
I guess I can start. I think that the work that I did, which is the video game machine for designing the Owens Lake, is, I think what you were saying about the displaced anthropogenic in terms of the fact that is an anthropocentric world, but it's been displaced to some extent by our tooling, by our rational approach to the world. That my work in some ways is approaching that issue and basically attempting to make it anthropocentric in a conscious way, so that I'm actually repositioning the human body and the human sensibilities within the sort of displaced anthropocentric world, Anthropocene. And so I think it's a little bit different in that way, in the sense that I think that we don't acknowledge the extent of our human authorship, and that the world has become more and more an anthropocentric world, in the sense that in the future, more of everything that we do is going to be filtered through our eyes and our machines and our tools, and that we have to include the body and our sensibility as sort of a kind of optimist approach, that might be the only hope that we have, is that if we actually kind of problematize that transaction where right now we're just measuring the world and then making it without really thinking hard about that process of authorship. The machine puts the body and the person and this human sensibility and all sorts of attendant problems of kind of playfulness and design and experience. It puts that into the equation and kind of problematizes the displaced approach. So I think that in some ways it kind of runs a little bit counter to this idea of kind of taking out the human. It kind of shoves you back into the machine. And it's really trying to break through these engineering paradigms that have completely displaced it. And to a large extent, the work is based on research where I found that the human body is really deeply embedded in all these engineering practices anyway. So we might as well acknowledge that and have a more positive attitude about it.
Can I ask you, just as a quick follow-up, Alex, in your project, is there, within that feedback loop, is there a way that I can see the physical implications or material implications of the choices that I make operating with that machine?
Yeah, it's sort of, all these pieces are attending the simulation.
I mean, so in a similar way, there, much of my work deals with the way we engineer river systems, which has, long been a practice of minimizing the amount of variables that are present and essentially simplifying rivers so that we know what the outcome is. Currently, we think of that process as one that essentially is about protecting humanity. It's centering humanity in that process, and then remediating the effects in order to think of other species. And I think part of the kind of shift in that is that our ability to imagine, rather than optimizing those river systems for a single variable, that we are instead, very precisely creating the platforms, essentially, landscape platforms through geomorphology, that allow multiple species to have agency in those environments. Part of that then is about a continued interaction with that system. So rather than imagining that we're going to somehow model the world to a high level of precision and then have the perfect response to that, it's setting up this continual relationship between the kind of the very precise understanding of the world that we live in, and then allowing for these other species to have agency within that platform or framework.
I think the Theater of Lost Species, which is the green iridescent creature you've seen on the screen. So it was a project, that probably conceptually emerged maybe 10 years ago. And my partner Natalie and I were watching a program about the Galileo deep sea probes that humans are sending out, deep into the galaxy and the universe. And we began kind of, at that time, thinking a little bit about what that would look like if we did that on planet Earth, right? If we started to make vessels to kind of record and potentially communicate on planet Earth with whatever's here in say 1,000 years. And so that project actually happened. We actually wrote a series of kind of science fiction pieces first. So actually started through writing. And those writings were, it's interesting, the writings were they were a little grim, and then we started to think about what, in a visual standpoint, what this would be, and began to kind of cross-engineer this piece. And so one of the motivations was kind of thinking about how would you leave something behind that would last 1,000 years? How would you leave something that was strong enough and smart enough and energy conscious enough and could camouflage itself and could kind of have elements of bio kind of mimicry and really kind of live in its environment, and yet still record and also potentially communicate. So the Theater of Lost Species is both a kind of search and discovery vessel, but it also can communicate. So those kind of pokey pieces can also project images or something, we're not sure what. So it's both a communicator and so from our perspective, it was a design challenge to begin to kind of speculate what you would leave. It would want to mix in. It would want to be biological. We weren't sure whether it would need to be machinic on some level, synthetic. And so really that was it's really just a big science fiction art project on some level. And that's what you're seeing upstairs, and that was really the concept behind it.
Hello. So the picture you saw that was of the kind of floating suns with people reaching out for each other, that was mine. That belongs to a kind of series of photographs. So that's actually just a photograph of a 4-foot by 5-foot model that I spent too much time building for one photograph. And I read this idea after having completed those a couple of years back, but
having recently read this book by Donna Haraway called Staying with the Trouble, there's this kind of great kind of conversation she has about the Anthropocene, but really saying, wouldn't it be great if instead of seeing it as this big epic, that instead archaeologists dig back and find instead just a very thin cellophane layer of what we understand as the Anthropocene, so that it doesn't become this kind of great epic that we're moving into, but instead just a kind of little hiccup in a kind of much larger story. And she kind of goes into talking about these ideas of tentacles and string figures as basically ways of reaching out to plausibilities that we may not be thinking of otherwise. And I thought those were particularly interesting because they weren't representational specifically. I know how much architects and landscape architects like drawings and representations. And this seemed more of like a mental design exercise. And so with that image, even though that was done prior to that, similar to what was just discussed, is that in an odd way, that those images are about social interaction. They're about people. And it's the idea of thinking about, in that case, it was these kind of movable suns, and the idea of what if our landscapes actually, the same way we construct lighting, street lighting, what if they instead had these other forms of energy embedded in them? And the human body actually was able to absorb different responsibilities and senses. That seems, in a weird way, rather straightforward, but it's actually trying to figure out what the kind of spatial typologies might be and what some of the forms of limitations might be, meaning the fact that not everybody may have access to this and that our public spaces may be striated, and that you may actually get groups of people who have different access to different information and to different senses and to different public spaces. And so those were just a series of photographs that actually look back, I won't dissect it, but look back to kind of historic paintings and figures in past and kind of recomposing them into current, known social conditions into new kind of technological spaces, and that we're kind of tackling same problems, just different time frames.
Maybe I'll just add a little to, I think these are all kind of really, one of some of the reasons why we chose some of these pieces, because what we were trying to find, and I think what a lot of people are trying to find now is new kinds of relations. So once that kind of, Isla, you talked about the kind of, we already decentered ourselves, in early modernism, but it was kind of replaced with a kind of societies of the societies of modernist control, and these have kind of gotten us to a certain point that we're realizing that they're not, that there's limitations and huge problems, and so a lot of the contributors to the exhibition, as well as authors that we're all reading, are calling for a kind of different, both a decentering and a recentering. Both, it's really about a kind of relational politics and reinscribing both humans, but also other species, non-humans, and the planet itself. Into relations that are not necessarily quantifiable, that are not that may have aspects of obviously technology and quantification, but are not reduced to those kinds of relations either. So they're much more complicated, and I think this is what a lot of the work is trying to do.
Thank you all. See, I'm realizing. Oh, there we go. So I'm glad Donna Haraway was brought up a couple times, because I think that one of the sort of touchstones, one of the pieces that she wrote, which is now almost 3 decades ago, her sort of cyborg manifesto. She spoke about blurring the lines between, on the one hand, we could say the human and the vegetal, zoological, biological on the one hand, but also between the human and the technological on the other. She also talked about sort of blurring the lines between science fiction and reality, which I also think is a really interesting one in relation to a lot of the work that's in the exhibition, and how these things mix. And I used to always use Donna Haraway's sort of example to say, you know, we think of cyborgs always in relation to this kind of science fiction image, but as long as I wear glasses and walk around with a iPhone, I'm a cyborg. You know, the way I think, the way I operate, I can't imagine my world that isn't sort of technologically mediated sort of already. But I think that this notion of new relational politics is a really interesting one, because it's tied to this idea of how we are, let's say, decentering our kind of anthropocentric stance. So I wanted to ask about the kinds of specific mixtures that you selected in relation to that crossing between the human, animal, vegetable, biological landscape, and technology, how these come together. I mean, in the exhibition, there's some places where this is really obvious, you know, Perry Culper's bird motels, which existed, you know, in this great image. But of course, it's not just that they're bird perches and bird motels. He's taking the programming from sort of bourgeois human values and projecting it onto a bird motel. Like, why would the bird need a spa? Does the bird need a spa? Is that something that we, you know, more of our anthropocentrism sort of projected onto the way in which we understand species, Ariane's Harrison Atelier's mixture of, say, you know, combining the birds, bees, in a wall system, an architectural wall system, because it's all about how we co-inhabit. And so maybe within the systems that you developed, you know, how did you decide drones and snakes, for example, or the things that you draw from? Do they become just signifiers, or do they have more meaning than that? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is actually regarding, we have a piece in our, you know, our own show, and so there's a piece called Shadow Time. It's a big kind of box, and it actually is a piece that is in that works on a project that we're actually working on an archaeological site, and so all of those images in the drawing are actually there. We're serving it with drones, and there are actual snakes. But that piece was trying to use kind of some of the ideas of, you know, how do some of these ideas of let's say blurred boundaries make us think differently about how we approach design and how we approach working on a piece of the earth. And so working on an archaeological site is really interesting. Also, it's got a kind of deep and really interesting geology, which would take a long time to talk about. But all of those, that history there is actually quite present. It's not just a site that we go to and manipulate, and it's not just a site that exists in the past, it exists in the present. And as we start to work on it, we start to add to this these kind of layers that start to get intermixed and intermingled in these kind of temporal slippages of the past. You know, what we think is the past, but it's actually still going on. Geology is still happening, and you know, the fragments of the city are still present. And so trying to think about and so within that drawing there, the design is there, but it's harder to see because it's not the most, it may not be the most important thing. It might be the most important thing to us as we think about it and work on it. But in terms of thinking about a place, how do you think about it in different ways? How do you think about, this kind of more hybrid way of working? So those were not signifiers. They were, you know, everything is actually very incredibly literal in that drawing. It has been measured, has been, you know, is the actual things that exist on the site. in a lot of the, and sorry, you asked, I've lost the first question about what were the crossings, or what?
So in some ways, part of the question is, I am looking at different kinds of intersections, and those intersections are going to depend on what the territory is that I might be dealing with in the first place. But there's also a question of a kind of point of view. Like, it's one thing if we, let's say we expand, in your particular case, we expand our tools of seeing so that beyond human perception, we understand materials through thermal imaging, or we understand them through other kinds of technologies. Are we also understanding them through the perspective of the animals and insects that we're drawing from, or do they still become kind of objects in our system that we're looking at and moving into the mix, but we're not actually understanding it from that perspective? Like, I was thinking that, Jason, in relation to your theater of the lost species, because it's saying, well, am I just lamenting, right, the sort of extinction of fish? This becomes part of my new virtual history. Or do I use that theater to actually see the world the way a fish sees the world? And maybe not just see through its own perceptual apparatuses, but something that changes, and this goes back to the sort of the first question, that changes our orientation of the world as always being represented there for us, right?
Well, I think it's very hard to literally displace ourselves from ourselves and our own perceptions, but there are a couple of people who are working on that, and one of the most interesting artists that's in the show is a woman named Lindsay French, and she's at the School of Art in Chicago, and she has been working on developing communication with plants, and quite literally trying to communicate with plants. But the way that she tries to understand this or work on this is to, on one hand, she uses technologies to start to create a kind of shared language that perhaps, she wrote a book with an oak tree that was, she read it, I don't know, I'm forgetting the name of she read James Joyce's Ulysses to the oak tree, and then the impulses were translated, the impulses of the oak tree were translated through an algorithm into a new text. That was a co-written book with an oak tree. She also tries to, but she talks a lot about a kind of opening yourself up to, with plants, to this kind of vulnerability. So she tries to create relations with plants by infecting herself with poison ivy liquid. And by doing that, it's actually not seen as something hostile, but kind of accepting the poison of the ivy as the ivy's form of communication with us. And so we, in order to find, it may, and that's why, some of these might be very discomforting and might not be the way that we usually communicate amongst ourselves. So, and not a lot of the there's a few artists exploring this, but it's and we're trying to find some of these kind of weak signals where some people were trying to kind of get into this territory. But Ursula Le Guin also talks about kind of languages of plants and rock languages, and how we just recently, only this century, we discovered that that dolphins have communication and have actually complex forms of communication. And she speculated that in the future we'll be shocked when we say, "What? You can't speak eggplant?" And so, yeah. So it's an ongoing project.
Well, I'll just say something about this idea of the cyborg, and it's the term is often, I kind of equate it to the idea of the Turing test in computation. This idea that we're always thinking that the Turing test denotes that somehow we are convinced that the thing on the other side is human. And in a way, the kind of idea of the cyborg speaks to something that's wholly not human, right? And that marker keeps kind of moving away from us. And so, because we keep redefining what that means, and I think when we talk about that in terms of the environment, it's in a way, it's the way I believe landscape architects have been talking about landscape for a very long time. It's in some sense continues to move away from us as our technologies get more and more advanced. Our perceptions of what the landscape is, right, or what nature is, kind of continually marches ahead of us, right, and we're in some ways chasing that. And so the idea of kind of the way I think we really implement technology almost speaks more to the idea of the prosthetic, and the idea that we're kind of like using this way of propping up nature or the environment, and the cyborg is in some ways an aspirational term about this kind of integration of technology and this, Lindsay French is getting at this idea of communication, but in a ways it's building these or interfacing with the landscape in a way that's about this ongoing reciprocity or communication with the environment itself. Right?
I would just follow up on that a little bit in terms of the Owens Lake, which is this dry lake that was reinvented. One of the things that actually originally drew me to the lake was that it seemed like there was no human hand in a sort of conscious aesthetic way, that there wasn't any obvious place for humans in that whole landscape. And what I realized later was that it was very much kind of a cyborg landscape, and unconsciously, because one of the innocent sort of things about it was that it was a very amazing, it was an incredible bird landscape, and that was something that was entirely emphasized over any sort of human engagement or interaction or thought about sort of experience. But of course, the birding on the lake was entirely the result of an aesthetic engagement with birding in that space, which was this like panopticon where you could drive anywhere on this 100 square mile lake and see all the birds on the lake in a course of a day. So there was this really powerful inflection of aesthetics into the actual landscape of the redesign of the lake, because all this birding data became critical for the redesign. So it sort of I began to realize there was this connection between the kind of birding potential and the aesthetics of birding that had sort of trumped any sort of engagement about thinking about it as an artistic landscape or a human landscape or a place that you experience. But of course, that underlaid everything that it was entirely that some sort of siloed, very specialized experiences. So the work in some ways that I've been doing is trying to figure out the sort of relational politics of all these data streams that are very much create this kind of cyborg landscape, but in a way that we don't really have a grasp on, that we don't understand how that works, how all those relations come together. So the machine that I was doing was like essentially interested in this idea of an interface, which I think is part of the cyborg idea, is like how do you design the interface that takes in the data sets and be conscious of how those intermingle as you create and reinvent the entire world through all of these different data streams that ultimately come back to us and are very much influenced by our scaffold, by our glasses, by our cell phones. So anyway, you get kind of lost in all that, but I think that the interesting part of it is thinking about that interface moment as a design opportunity, and seeing how that inflects into everything else that we do.
One of the things that we did as a part of the Theater of Lost Species project, we worked with these folks at Stanford who are paleobiologists. And at a certain point, we were simply trying to visualize, or we were trying to come to grips with, sort of maybe through Thomas Jefferson, thinking about someone who's an obsessive kind of collector. I imagine if curious human being like that was alive today, what they would run around with, it wouldn't be just a sketchbook and a camera. It would probably be a LiDAR sensor, a UV I don't know what they would, just think about all the ways that someone would want to measure the world now, and all of the technologies and all of the sensing devices that one would have at their disposal just on their phone, but all the more sophisticated things. So we began to kind of think about what that would mean. So if this theater of lost species was a kind of out in the world searching and seeking and trying to map and scan and 3D scan and trying to understand relationships and cross relationships and interbreeding and all these kinds of things, how would you form a map or an interface of the world? Because I think what would actually have to happen is that the theater of lost species would have to have a massive supercomputer at its core, because really to even map a single species and to come to grips with it, it would be cross species, right? And so you'd be building this kind of deep web. So I love what you're getting at, but it's also playing through with these really, really smart people about what it means when you take a species and you begin to kind of try and understand how you if it goes extinct, like how do you bring it back, right? And how complex that is as a kind of endeavor. And so I think what I love, I just went up and saw the show now. I love that the show, there's a lot of work, including our own piece, which I find completely naive in a way, in a Jeffersonian way, because you do what you can do and you think about what you can think. And I love that there's a sort of, there's kind of skepticism, there's a little bit of optimism. Adam's piece, it's like a piece of foam mud or something made out of fiberglass, rocks, and then Brad's piece, which is a sort of, if you were just to take a close-up image of it, you wouldn't really understand it as a cyborg, sand dune. But I like that there's a sort of an attempt at kind of recreating worlds that are totally naive, but also lead you to think about, all these cross nets and all these kind of cross connections. Yeah.
I'm just gonna, in kind of, in some of the work actually, we kept finding that there's a kind of, a resurgent naturalism, like these kind of, bringing back, at a time when we have such tools at our disposal, there's also a kind of a lot of, and this is kind of, and what was interesting was we were finding this across architects, landscape architects, and artists, which was also part of the something that we noticed was that these disciplines were kind of talking to each other, perhaps not necessarily talking to each other, but playing with some of these ideas were bubbling up in all these different fields, and so we had kind of architects, landscape architects, and artists, let's say, doing exploring this kind of Alexander von Humboldtian kind of rediscovery of the planet, and so there's this kind of rediscovery of things in a kind of nascent moment, and maybe just as naive. But kind of, I think that makes it actually hopeful, as opposed to, a lot of environmental practices that think they have answers. And so we were trying to, as we say, kind of cultivate an environmental sensibility, which is less about having answers, but more about kind of trying to ask questions through the tools and practices that we have as designers, as architects, as landscape architects, and as artists, and trying to find what those questions are worth asking.
One of the, I'm glad at some point, Kathy, you'd referred to kind of our acts of design in some ways, because I often talk about design as a place where the imagination or fictions become real, and I actually think that it's a really powerful thing that we don't claim enough in our fields, meaning that it's not, if the world of art in some ways becomes a kind of commentary on the real, that through design there's this moment where the imagination exists, and fictions become real at the moment that they are made, which is a kind of fantastic thing when you think about it, that when it gets built out in the world, perhaps maybe not in the gallery, but even in the gallery, it now becomes an idea. That idea is real, and because it's in my imagination, it has some stronghold or foothold, let's say, in reality. And again, going back to Haraway, she also talked about this kind of blurry line between science fiction and reality. When we think about biotechnologies and what we're actually doing to the body, and we've been doing that through engineering to our planet, the kind of terraforming of the earth, the canalization of all of our major rivers, et cetera. And we've redefined it through the models that we ourselves have created by, in some ways, reducing the incredible complexity of that world to a far more simplistic model, an engineering model, a particular mathematical model, which is why I think the representations in the end become so critical, or the media that we use and the ways in which we're operating. So maybe if I can kind of shift this to the modes of representation and the media, because I would say, for example, Brad, in your work, the huge shift from this notion of seeing the river as a shape or as a thing, as a kind of object, to something that becomes a fluid and dynamic system that I now design with, that I have to develop a new model for design, a new model for representation. And you have a kind of living, dynamic, fluvial model as the basis, of what you're operating with, as Alex, yours is as well, in terms of how you think about it. So maybe you can talk about the development of the model, or how its impact on design.
So, just to be very honest about the start of it, I started off extremely naively in working in southern Louisiana and trying to interface with the people who had power, the Army Corps of Engineers and others who had amazing models of the rivers, were working with those models, and had long decades of practice developed in order to kind of use them and implement them. And so it originally started with the idea that somehow I was going to be modeling rivers just like the Army Corps, and I would get really good at it, and I would be able to stand shoulder to shoulder and tell them why they should be designing these landscapes differently. And you quickly come to the realization that it's a very naive viewpoint, and that in reality our ability to imagine a different type of ecology or river or fluvial system requires a whole new set of tools. And so that's the whole kind of implementation of the model, the physical models we're using are they are taking on the fact that these are modeling basic attributes, and that rather than thinking about the result of those as something to implement, it's developing ways of interacting with the model as it's forming that becomes a way of just essentially forming a new paradigm for interacting with the scale of the territory. So it's essentially shifting that idea that we're going to model and then implement, and instead saying that it's about designing the processes and procedures. And so for me, that the big shift occurred once I began to realize that was really the avenue that where we had some form of agency in that. And so in that regard, then it really sets up the concept that rather than essentially if we're moving in a certain direction and we're trying to become more and more efficient, rather than kind of greasing that slide and saying we just need to move faster down it, it's really saying that what we should start looking at is that maybe there's some sort of resistance in this system, and there's ways of designing actual forms of resistance that might fracture it, break it, or cause it to fail in ways that actually give us new generative potential. And for me, that's the types of models and kind of interaction with models that I find in these highly complex systems. It's these moments where it breaks and fails that you then have some way of kind of post-rationalizing, post-analyzing it to understand how you might develop these kind of novel forms of interaction with these large-scale systems.
That's great. Maybe specifically, I can ask you, Sean, because of the nature of your work and the types of, you choose photography, you choose to model, these things, and I'm really curious about it, especially. I mean, I think that the range of representation within the exhibition is really interesting, and there are some projects like the indexing and drawing of the wind by Mark Nystrom, the wind process. I thought that was great. We often, think about wind and we draw it as this like single squiggly line, and there's this incredibly complex system of movement. So, and I was very curious, especially given the ways that you're thinking about atmosphere, the kinds of models that you're using, or the photographs, which are very, very different, let's say, than what Brad is operating with.
Yeah, so I should say that, and I may be coming back to those at some point, but that those are a very particular time frame. It was after finishing writing a book where I had an anxiety that I had lost the ability to design, and decided I was going to reinvigorate that side of my brain. But yeah, representation, I think, does play a big role, and I think it shifts a lot. And I think if there's something I would mention about the show that I really appreciate, it's that it refrains from giving it a title. I know that makes it difficult sometimes to how to organize space, but with that in mind, it's also, I think, tied a lot to the representation, in the sense that there are lots of forms of representation in here. And I am thankful for, in a lot of ways, is that there is a conversation that I think is ongoing. It's been ongoing for a while, and it's going to continue to go. And precisely because it doesn't have a title or a representational style, I think that gives it more legs. And I'm thinking of Ursula Le Guin, the kind of struggle she had with the term fantasy, that like a genre of work that kind of fell in this idea of fantasy, and having to kind of shake that in some way. And also thinking about, I don't know if I heard this or read this somewhere, but Greg Lynn, the architects, one of his regrets is that coining the terms blob and bleb and how closely tied they were to architecture and to a technique of representation stifled a lot of that work. And he thought that that really kind of was a problem for him later in his career. And I think there's something about the fact that there are a lot of voices now about this, and that there's not, I mean, at some way it can be seen as a limitation, in terms of media and being able to give it a quick terminology that it all falls under, which I'm happy that it doesn't exist, because it also means that I think it allows for a kind of larger trajectory and multiplicity of voices about a subject matter that doesn't have a quick fix, that doesn't have a quick aesthetic, that doesn't have a quick image. And because of that, I think that goes back to the representational question, the fact that you can't point to a technique of representation that is emblematic of a diverse range of work, but also as an architect, it doesn't pigeonhole me into having to produce one type of thing. So whether it is models or simulations or schematic, whatever that work is, I think it doesn't have to be imageable in the same way that maybe work in the past or in the last, say, 25 years of architecture often had to be. It's also much more difficult in many regards, but I think it does have its benefits.
I think that was one of the ideas with the exhibition, and in many, we called it a salon, but in many ways it's kind of, we talked a lot about cabinets of curiosity as both emblematic of a time, a kind of pre-Enlightenment time, where category, before encyclopedias, where categories were still blurred, and objects of art and objects of science kind of commingled, and a kind of interest in the fact that there is kind of this this commingling again between kind of science and art, and in a lot of this work, even if and so it's not just just about aesthetics, but also embedded with a lot of technologies and science. But yeah, that there isn't, there's both kind of strange objects that we don't know what they are, and they have stories. There's different kinds of drawings. There's photographs. There's different kind of scenographies, as ways to tell narratives, new stories. There's machines, and there's technological objects. So I think if there's an overarching image of the whole exhibition, it is the kind of cabinet of curiosities with all of its various modes of representation.
So last question before I open it up, and this comes from something you said as well, Kathy, that it's not about sort of restoration or abandonment. But, Timothy Morton had said that we desperately need an appropriate level of shock and anxiety concerning the ecological trauma of our age. And the question is, it's the issue of shock and anxiety versus aestheticization. Or do we abandon the project of trying to foreground that kind of shock and anxiety through certain works that might be in the exhibition or not? This becomes a kind of political one in some ways, but I want to know the position of all of you.
I can start, actually, because when we had the symposium at Taubman College, we invited a speaker named Jennifer Peoples. She works she's actually in the field of communications, and she's written on both the terms the toxic sublime and then the toxic grotesque, and the way that shock and both, the way that the rhetorics and communication of environmentalism has moved from, let's say, these kind of sublime shock of the devastation of landscapes to now the toxic grotesque, where bodies are the fish with the plastic bits in it, and these kind of mutated bodies that become more grotesque than the kind of large scale landscapes, but she also talked about the limits to that kind of work can do. Once you get over that realization, what do you do? And I think that's kind of what the work that's in the show is kind of, once you have encountered this, are there multiple forms of engaging with it? And is there and I think that there's one kind of politics that definitely needs to kind of rally with governments and try to change policies and change environmental policy, but there's also another kind of politics in aesthetic practices, in actually kind of finding new ways to talk about this, even amongst ourselves, and so, yeah, and maybe I'm not giving any answers, but I think those are hints and clues that are in a lot of the works, and so I don't want to kind of point to one that has the answer. None of them do, but there are other kinds of ways of talking about this condition.
But just to chime in real quick is just to say that your point of after anxiety and what have you, the question of what's next, I think, is the responsibility and the opportunity, I think, for the architect. And I think that's a unique position that we're in. And I think Timothy Morton answers his own question with some other publication that recently came out where he talks, it's a book about, it's called Being Ecological, where he talks about overcoming the kind of moral do-good, or the kind of, trying to make it overcome this idea of it making it being a moral imperative, or trying to scare us, because at that point it kind of shuts down the conversation. And I mean, there's something to that, to be aware of our context and our situation, but there's also the ability, I think, or the opportunity within design is to entice people into lifestyles, possibilities, social engagement, aesthetics that also have within them smuggled other responsibilities and opportunities that can bring people along. And so I don't think it's cynical to do that. I don't think it's necessarily a capitalistic or consumer-driven mentality, but I think sometimes it's important to learn from some of these things, that maybe the big stick is sometimes not as good as the attractive carrot, and that maybe there are ways in which if we could project little worlds that people want to be a part of, that maybe you could get people into these conversations, at least engage a conversation in some meaningful way. And as designers, I think this is what, this is what we've been trained for. The opportunity's here.
Maybe we could open it up to questions of the panel before we move upstairs. We've got a roving microphone. Comments, questions, thoughts?
Hi, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the title of the whole exhibit. I think it's interesting that so much of the work in it is sort of computational or data dependent in some way, which is sort of by its nature super precise. And so then there kind of becomes this interesting tension that you're using precision to generate ambiguity. And I wonder if you could speak about that concept at all.
It's interesting that you had the impression that the show is actually largely computational, because a lot of it isn't. It just the people on this panel might, and I realize that as everyone started talking, do use computation a lot, but in the show itself, there's a lot of really non-computational methods. In fact, kind of a lot of different methodologies that include kind of a lot of kind of almost kind of resurgent techniques of, let's say, black and white, kind of almost like etching type drawings, or also a lot of different kinds of drawings, model making, the Adam Fury's rocks, Ellie's inside things, post rock by Meredith Miller and Tom Moran, which kind of resynthesizes waste plastic into a new conglomerate material. A lot of the works are, I think, the coming to terms with the technological mediation of the world right now is also just part of the work, and it's part of the way that we, a lot of us do produce work. So I think that, and maybe I don't think of the show as highly computational myself.
I would just add that I think that Brad and I are sort of doing similar work in the sense that we are introducing computation, very rigorous computational methods, into a dialogue with artistic and design practices. So there is that interest in how did these objective methodologies interface with subjective concerns, especially in my work. So I'm very much interested in bringing in the most relevant and powerfully politically consequential model that has all the data that people are watching, and producing the results that are dictating the design, and seeing what happens if we engage it with other ways of representing that data, other ways of engaging with the sort of decision-making process that you use, that you are using that data for. So, and I think that does, I was thinking like, well, how is my work ambiguous? I think that's kind of where the ambiguity comes in, is that sort of kind of irreconcilable issue that you can't ever fully reconcile the subjective and the objective in a sensible way. So as designers, maybe we can do that through our kind of crazy methods and ways of thinking about the world.
We're all a very sophisticated group, and I've really learned a great deal about a number of references from 3 decades ago and currently on the subject. But I know that Jason has 2 young daughters, and I wonder, having read to our children, our grandchildren, if it's in the imaginations of the stories that we read to children that actually this kind of engagement of human and animal and nature and plants could be found in children's literature through that. When I think about Jason's traveling machine that's observing the world, it's like Humpty Dumpty. I wish it would fall down, maybe crack, and then with all those projections on inseminate the earth to begin again, a new relationship on that. So I do think that there may be, just in the field of what we easily introduce the world to, in terms of children's literature, that it would be a very nice dialogue with science fiction and all these other observations. We bring them into the world, and why do they lose it so quickly, or not?
Yeah, just an antidote was back to maybe Isla's question, and when I was young, maybe 10, 15 years old, I can remember looking at my parents and wondering why they fucked up the planet so badly. like I can remember looking at them saying, you're so ignorant, and you have destroyed the earth, and you're not doing anything about it. And then sort of fast forward to the point where I have 2 young daughters, and now realizing, how complex those questions were, and how, I hate to say that I'm complicit, but how your mode might shift from sort of looking out at the world and looking for, cause and effect, and looking for, these sort of black and white kind of reasoning behind things. And then suddenly you're in the hot seat, and you have these 2 amazing, curious, going to be incredibly intelligent young children looking at you, asking the same kinds of questions. And the idea of storytelling, I think, is really important. And in that theater of lost species sort of kind of narrative was really this idea that maybe if everything is lost, this becomes this kind of arc of knowledge, but not in a mere narrative kind of fashion, but like in a encapsulating like radical capacities for simulation and biological reintegration, and sort of this complete fantasy that we might actually be able to kind of create something. And I would argue that to produce that, it is a highly computational, at least I believe, it is potentially highly computational. It is highly technical. It is almost spiritual too, right? Because it's an impossibility. You sort of have to believe that it is possible. So I think it's a great question, and I think back to the show, and I think the show is it is a lot of stories, and it is a lot of narratives, and it is a lot of kind of fantasy about a world that we're both terrified that we're going to move into it, but we're pretty damn confident that we're definitely going in that direction. So there's optimism, and there's this sort of idea. I think some of the work, I think is pretty optimistic. I think Sean Lally's project is actually pretty optimistic on some level. Multiple suns, I think of energy, and I wonder about where that comes from, and I wonder about I could have sworn one of the people had 6 fingers in one of your renderings. The woman in the foreground had 6 fingers. I thought that's so weird and cool. It might have just been the Mare effect on the drawing, but you should keep playing that out. But I love, for me, that was the ambiguity and the kind of stress of even humans in any of the drawings up there. There's a sort of, we're kind of here, and it's kind of weird, but we're still social animals, and we're still eating things, and we're still communicating, and all this kind of stuff. So it's a weird, ambiguous world, and it's cool.
I mean, just to pick up on this idea of computation, I mean, we use this term precise. I mean, computation is really this this idea of very precise abstractions of the world, and I think in that regard, the project for us as designers really sits between computation, which it really isn't media or anything else. It's a form of abstracting different models, and then our place is really in that interface between how it then affects or becomes the physical world around us. And that project is its own representational project. It's its own project about construction. It's its own thing that we're deeply embedded in. So I don't think there's much we're doing today without computation, quite honestly. But for us, I think for almost all of us, that's something that doesn't really matter. It's really this kind of in between, this kind of mediating project that it's new forms of representation, new forms of media, new ways of taking that imaginary and putting it out there in the physical world.
And I just want to kind of answer this question because I don't have an answer, but I liked it enough to to want to try, which is this realization, thinking back about literature and like what children read, and also realizing now how quickly kids forget what they used to read, and realizing that they don't remember the books you used to show them. But also, at the same time, thinking back within my own life, maybe when you were talking about that, was a book, what book in my life did I remember kind of triggering some of these conversations? And one of them was called The Tracker. I think I was 14, and it's about learning to track animals in the Pine Barrens. Point being, it was a book that was not required reading in high school, but we knew one teacher recommended it so much that probably a third of us did read it. And so you're talking about a book that I know a third of my student body read, not because it was required, but because an instructor, a teacher at that level found it important enough that we should all read it. And I think that's a lot of work, but extremely important. And I'm thinking, too, just the fact that a lot of new genre of writing is occurring now, too, especially in science fiction, that has to do with climate. And realizing that, how do we tackle these kind of complex aspects? And of course, like everything, we're talking about this idea of striation of titles. This becomes yet another subgenre of science fiction. That science fiction needs another subgenre, but it is interesting to realize that these things do kind of move through the populace. And the question is, as architects, always struggling in a kind of insecure way about giving up control, maybe this is just another avenue where you realize this has to be a team effort.
Hi, Kathy. Earlier in your introduction, you mentioned about how this exhibition and the symposium stemmed out of the response to how we deal with climate change or Anthropocene. And then you also talked about the terms ecopoetics or the new emerging environmental sensibilities. So I'm curious, in all of your work, how you position your work in the realm of climate change. What should the idea of climate change be in order to facilitate this new modes of thinking or sensibility for design as a way to bridge between, this aesthetics and sensibility to somewhere that we can move more towards the design?
You're asking about my own work, not the exhibition, or just everyone? Okay, yeah. Maybe I'll start. One of the things that that actually this is more in terms of the teaching, but I read this piece from The Drowned World, and there's we've been trying to think about how do we what's important to think about in terms of ecology and even climate change, and there's been a lot of work in trying to, let's say, think that we can try to fix or stop climate change, but what we don't think enough about is how do we live with climate change, or how do we what is living in a rapidly changing climate going to mean for design, for architects and for designers, and so in some ways it's developing kind of sensibilities and thinking about that. In terms of some of my own work, especially in terms of a lot of the kind of responsive work that we do, we actually try to use technology not as a kind of we try to use technology as a way to develop kind of new relationships, usually kind of communications technology and responsive technology for let's say buildings that might start to kind of how we can, that might start to kind of intervene into the way that things are made and thought about. And so those are just maybe just a couple of examples, but and maybe I'll let some of the others answer.
One of the things that I think that the exhibition kind of gets at a little bit is this issue that when we deal in a kind of adapt to climate change, do we understand that we're not just kind of fixing the crisis or the problem, but that we're making the next world at that moment? And And I don't think that our society is very aware that that's how it works, and that we sort of focus on one crisis at a time, solve that crisis, and then reckon with what we've made later as a kind of actual world that we've created. So I think that the major role of design in this is to understand that that we're making a new world as we're fixing it or sort of surviving essentially.